The modern university has betrayed its sacred trust. What was once the citadel of wisdom has become a factory for ideology, churning out graduates indoctrinated rather than educated. I witnessed this transformation throughout my decades in academia, from my early years at Michigan State to my observations of the radical upheavals of the 1960s and beyond. The university, which should serve as guardian of our civilizational heritage, has instead become its chief underminer. Today's students receive not liberal education in the classical sense, but narrow technical training coupled with ideological programming. They learn skills without wisdom, facts without understanding, methods without purpose. The consequences extend far beyond campus walls, for the university shapes the minds that will lead society. When higher education abandons its mission to cultivate wisdom and virtue, it produces not educated citizens but dangerous half-educated ideologues who mistake slogans for truth and sentiment for thought. Chapter 1: The Original Mission: Universities as Guardians of Wisdom. The university, in its authentic form, exists to preserve and transmit the accumulated wisdom of civilization. This was the founding vision of the great medieval universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Paris, Bologna, institutions that emerged from the medieval synthesis of faith and reason. These universities understood their sacred duty, to form not merely clever technicians, but wise men capable of moral and intellectual leadership. The classical university curriculum reflected this mission. Students began with the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the foundational arts of clear thinking and noble expression. They proceeded to the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, which revealed the mathematical harmony underlying creation. Above all stood philosophy and theology, the queen of sciences, which ordered all knowledge toward ultimate truth. This educational hierarchy recognized a fundamental principle: knowledge without wisdom is dangerous, and wisdom without moral foundation is impossible. The university existed to form character as much as intellect, understanding that true education must address the whole person, mind, heart, and soul. Students learned to revere truth, to think with precision, to argue with charity, and to live with virtue. The American colonial colleges inherited this noble tradition. Harvard, founded in 1636, declared its purpose to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. Yale, Princeton, and other early institutions shared this conviction that education must serve both divine truth and human flourishing. These institutions produced the remarkable generation of American founders, men like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, whose classical education enabled them to craft a constitutional system drawing upon centuries of political wisdom. They understood Aristotle's forms of government, Cicero's reflections on law, and the English constitutional tradition. Their education was both broad and deep, combining practical skills with philosophical understanding. But this classical vision contained within itself the seeds of its own transformation. The Enlightenment emphasis on reason, initially harmonious with Christian faith, gradually grew independent and then hostile to transcendent truth. The German university model, with its emphasis on specialized research rather than integrated wisdom, began to influence American higher education in the 19th century. The elective system, championed by Harvard's Charles Eliot, replaced the unified curriculum with cafeteria-style course selection. Students could now avoid the challenging disciplines that formed intellectual rigor and moral character. The university began its fateful drift from wisdom toward mere information, from formation toward fragmentation. Chapter 2: The Rise of Specialization and the Death of Liberal Learning. The transformation of the American university accelerated dramatically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as institutions abandoned their integrative mission in favor of German-inspired specialization. What emerged was not education but training, narrow, technical, and divorced from the moral and intellectual foundations necessary for genuine wisdom. The research university model, imported from Germany, emphasized original investigation over the transmission of inherited knowledge. Professors became specialists rather than teachers, valued more for their research publications than their ability to form young minds. Graduate schools multiplied, producing ever narrower experts who knew more and more about less and less. This specialization destroyed the unity of knowledge that had characterized classical education. Where once all learning was understood to serve the pursuit of truth and wisdom, now each discipline became an autonomous kingdom with its own methods, assumptions, and vocabularies. Students lost any sense of how different fields of knowledge related to one another or to the fundamental questions of human existence. The elective system completed this fragmentation. Students, lacking the intellectual maturity to choose wisely, constructed incoherent programs of study based on interest, convenience, or career prospects rather than educational value. The curriculum became a marketplace rather than a carefully ordered progression toward wisdom. Liberal education, the education befitting a free person, withered as universities chased the false god of relevance. Literature courses abandoned the great works that had formed Western minds for centuries in favor of contemporary works chosen for their supposed social relevance rather than their artistic merit or moral insight. Philosophy departments turned from eternal questions to technical puzzles comprehensible only to other specialists. History, that teacher of political prudence and moral imagination, was rewritten to serve ideological purposes rather than convey the complex lessons of human experience. Students learned to judge the past by present standards rather than to learn from the wisdom of their ancestors. The great conversation between generations was replaced by a monologue of contemporary prejudices. Meanwhile, the sciences, liberated from philosophical and theological constraints, pursued knowledge without wisdom. Technical mastery increased while moral understanding declined. Students learned how to do many things but not whether they should do them. The university produced experts capable of building atomic weapons but incapable of reflecting seriously on their proper use. Business pressures reinforced these tendencies. Universities increasingly viewed students as customers and education as a product. Market forces encouraged institutions to offer what students wanted rather than what they needed. Since young people naturally prefer easy and immediately practical courses to challenging and seemingly abstract ones, academic standards inevitably declined. The professoriate, meanwhile, grew increasingly isolated from the concerns of ordinary citizens. Academic disciplines developed their own jargons, their own methods, their own criteria of success. Professors spoke primarily to other specialists rather than to the broader public they supposedly served. Chapter 3: The Radical Revolution, when ideology captured the academy. The 1960s marked the decisive moment when ideology conquered the American university. What had been a gradual drift toward specialization and fragmentation became a revolutionary transformation that explicitly rejected the university's traditional mission. The student radicals of that turbulent decade, supported by sympathetic faculty, demanded nothing less than the complete reconstruction of higher education along political lines. The violence at Columbia, Berkeley, Harvard, and dozens of other campuses was not merely youthful rebellion but a calculated assault on the very concept of objective truth and disinterested inquiry. The radicals understood intuitively what many administrators failed to grasp. The university's claim to seek truth transcending political considerations was incompatible with their revolutionary agenda. These ideologues rejected the notion that knowledge has value independent of its political utility. They insisted that all education is political and that the pretense of objectivity merely disguises the power relationships underlying academic disciplines. Literature, history, philosophy, and even the natural sciences were revealed to be instruments of oppression that must be reconstructed to serve the cause of liberation. The concept of in loco parentis, the university's responsibility to act as a moral guardian for its students, was among the first casualties of this revolution. Administrators, intimidated by student demands and faculty pressure, abandoned their duty to form character in favor of a misguided notion of freedom that confused license with liberty. Dormitories became sites of moral chaos rather than communities of learning. Academic freedom, that precious inheritance from medieval universities that protected genuine scholars from political interference, was perverted into a slogan for ideological conformity. Faculty who questioned radical orthodoxies found themselves marginalized, while those who embraced fashionable causes received promotion and tenure regardless of their scholarly credentials. The traditional curriculum was systematically dismantled and replaced with courses designed to serve political rather than educational purposes. Studies, programs, women's studies, ethnic studies, peace studies, proliferated, offering ideological indoctrination disguised as academic inquiry. These programs explicitly rejected the standards of evidence and argument that had governed serious scholarship. Great Books courses, which had introduced generations of students to the masterworks of Western civilization, were eliminated or transformed beyond recognition. The charge of Eurocentrism was wielded like a club to silence anyone who suggested that Shakespeare might have more to teach than contemporary authors chosen primarily for their race or gender. The very notion of a canon, a body of works recognized for their enduring value and universal significance, was rejected as an instrument of oppression. Students were encouraged to view tradition not as accumulated wisdom but as a conspiracy of dead white males designed to perpetuate their privilege. Grade inflation accompanied this intellectual inflation. As standards declined and objective measures of achievement were abandoned, grades became meaningless. Students learned that effort and good intentions mattered more than actual accomplishment, preparing them poorly for a world that judges results rather than attitudes. Faculty hiring and promotion increasingly emphasized political reliability over scholarly competence. Departments sought candidates who would advance diversity goals rather than advance knowledge. The old ideal of the professor as a disinterested seeker after truth gave way to the new model of the professor as activist and advocate. This transformation was not imposed from outside but arose from within the university itself, as faculty and administrators embraced ideas fundamentally hostile to their institution's traditional mission. Chapter 4: The Corruption of Knowledge, How Ideology Replaced Scholarship. The capture of the university by ideological forces has corrupted the very nature of knowledge itself. What was once understood as the patient pursuit of truth through rigorous methods of inquiry has become a weapon in political warfare. The fundamental categories of thought, truth and falsehood, good and evil, beautiful and ugly, have been relativized to serve ideological purposes. The postmodern assault on objective truth provided the philosophical justification for this transformation. Under the influence of French theorists like Foucault and Derrida, American academics learned to view all claims to knowledge as manifestations of power rather than genuine discoveries about reality. Truth became merely a social construction, and the goal of education shifted from seeking truth to exposing the hidden power relationships supposedly embedded in traditional forms of knowledge. This intellectual relativism had devastating consequences for every academic discipline. In literature departments, the study of great works gave way to the deconstruction of texts designed to reveal their alleged racism, sexism, and imperialism. Students learned to approach Shakespeare not as a profound interpreter of human nature but as a representative of patriarchal oppression whose works required ideological correction rather than careful study. History departments abandoned the patient reconstruction of past events in favor of presentist moralizing that judged earlier eras by contemporary standards. The complex motivations and circumstances that shaped historical actors were ignored in favor of simple narratives of oppression and liberation. Students learned that the American founding was primarily about slavery rather than liberty, that Western civilization was essentially a history of exploitation, And that progress meant the progressive elimination of traditional institutions and beliefs. Philosophy, once the discipline that sought wisdom about the fundamental questions of existence, was reduced to technical puzzles accessible only to specialists or transformed into advocacy for favored political causes. The great questions that had animated philosophical inquiry for millennia: what is truth? What is justice? What constitutes the good life? Were either dismissed as meaningless or answered according to ideological formulas. Even the natural sciences, supposedly protected by their objective methods, were not immune to ideological corruption. Environmental science became a vehicle for political activism rather than dispassionate inquiry into natural phenomena. Biology was pressed into service to support or refute claims about human nature that had political implications. The very concept of scientific objectivity was challenged as a masculine construct designed to exclude women and minorities from scientific communities. The social sciences, always more vulnerable to ideological influence, became explicitly partisan. Sociology, anthropology, and political science departments hired faculty based on their commitment to progressive causes rather than their scholarly competence. Research questions were chosen for their political utility rather than their scientific importance, and conclusions were often determined in advance based on ideological commitments. This corruption of knowledge has profound implications beyond the academy. Students who receive such an education are ill-equipped to think clearly about complex problems or to engage seriously with ideas that challenge their preconceptions. They mistake slogans for arguments, confuse sentiment with reasoning, and view disagreement as evidence of moral failure rather than intellectual difference. The broader culture suffers as well, as universities fail in their duty to preserve and transmit the intellectual heritage of civilization. Instead of serving as guardians of knowledge, they have become agents of its destruction, teaching each new generation to despise the wisdom of their ancestors. Chapter 5: The Assault on Excellence: How Equality Ideology Destroyed Standards. The egalitarian ideology that has captured higher education recognizes no authority save its own leveling impulse. Excellence, that natural aristocracy of mind and character which true education seeks to cultivate, has been denounced as elitist and exclusionary. The result is not genuine equality but the tyranny of mediocrity, where the exceptional must be reduced to the level of the ordinary. This assault on excellence begins with the fundamental misunderstanding of human nature that underlies modern educational theory. The classical understanding recognized that individuals possess different capacities, talents, and interests, what we might call natural inequality in the proper sense. Education's task was to help each person develop his unique potential to its fullest extent, creating a natural hierarchy based on achievement and merit rather than birth or wealth. The modern university rejects this wisdom in favor of a crude egalitarianism that views all differences in achievement as evidence of systemic injustice. When some students consistently outperform others, the explanation cannot be differences in ability, effort, or preparation, it must be discrimination. This leads inevitably to the conclusion that standards themselves are instruments of oppression that must be eliminated or substantially lowered. Admissions policies reflect this ideological commitment to equality of outcomes rather than equality of opportunity. Merit-based selection, which had enabled universities to identify and cultivate exceptional talent regardless of social background, has been replaced by quota systems designed to achieve predetermined demographic results. Academic preparation and intellectual potential matter less than group membership, leading to the admission of students who are often ill-prepared for rigorous academic work. Once admitted, these students require extensive remedial support that further dilutes academic standards. Entire departments have been created to provide academic support that amounts to doing students' work for them or lowering expectations to match their abilities. The pretense is maintained that standards remain high while in reality they have been hollowed out to ensure that virtually everyone can succeed. Grade inflation serves this same leveling purpose. When nearly everyone receives A's and B's, grades lose their function as measures of achievement. Students learn that effort matters more than results, that good intentions count more than actual performance. This prepares them poorly for a world that judges competence rather than compliance with ideological expectations. The elimination of competitive elements from education reflects the same egalitarian impulse. Class rankings, honor societies, and academic prizes are either eliminated or modified to ensure that everyone can participate. The message is clear: excellence is inherently unfair because it implies that some are better than others at particular tasks. Faculty hiring and promotion policies mirror these student-focused changes. Departments seek professors who will advance diversity goals rather than maintain academic standards. Scholarly competence becomes secondary to ideological reliability and group membership. The result is a professoriate less capable of challenging students intellectually and more committed to affirming their predetermined beliefs. Research itself has been corrupted by this egalitarian ideology. Scholarly projects are valued not for their contribution to knowledge but for their service to approved political causes. Academic conferences feature papers selected more for their ideological content than their intellectual merit. Peer review, once a mechanism for maintaining scholarly standards, has become a means of enforcing conformity to progressive orthodoxy. The broader culture of the university reinforces these tendencies. Students learn that questioning certain premises is not merely wrong but morally suspect. Intellectual humility, the recognition that we might be wrong and have much to learn from others, is replaced by moral certainty that brooks no dissent. This destruction of excellence has consequences far beyond individual students or institutions. A society that systematically undermines its mechanisms for identifying and cultivating talent will inevitably decline relative to societies that maintain standards of achievement. Chapter 6: The Ideological Enforcement: How Dissent Became Heresy. The modern university has created a comprehensive system of ideological enforcement that would make totalitarian regimes envious. Under the guise of promoting tolerance and inclusion, academic institutions have established mechanisms of control that effectively silence dissent and punish nonconformity. The result is an intellectual monoculture that stifles genuine inquiry and transforms education into indoctrination. This enforcement begins with the hiring process itself. Academic job searches, supposedly conducted to identify the most qualified candidates, have become exercises in ideological screening. Job postings routinely require statements of commitment to diversity and inclusion that function as loyalty oaths to progressive orthodoxy. Candidates who cannot demonstrate sufficient enthusiasm for approved causes need not apply, regardless of their scholarly credentials. The tenure process reinforces these initial selections. Junior faculty learn quickly that certain topics are off-limits, certain conclusions unacceptable, and certain methodologies suspect. They understand that academic freedom protects only those who conform to departmental orthodoxies. Those who question feminist theory, challenge multiculturalist assumptions, or defend traditional values find their careers effectively terminated before they begin. Speech codes, ostensibly designed to prevent harassment and create welcoming environments, function as instruments of censorship. These codes typically prohibit language that makes anyone feel uncomfortable, effectively banning any serious discussion of controversial topics. Students and faculty learn to self-censor, avoiding subjects that might trigger complaints from protected groups or administrative intervention. The concept of microaggressions has extended this censorship to the most casual interactions. Any statement, gesture, or even facial expression that can be interpreted as showing insufficient sensitivity to approved groups becomes grounds for disciplinary action. The result is a climate of fear where genuine dialogue becomes impossible and everyone walks on ideological eggshells. Bias reporting systems encourage students and faculty to inform on colleagues who express unapproved opinions or ask uncomfortable questions. These systems, modeled on those used by police states to maintain social control, transform universities into surveillance societies where everyone monitors everyone else for signs of ideological deviation. The transformation of student orientation programs into ideological boot camps reveals the systematic nature of this indoctrination. Incoming students are subjected to intensive programming designed to instill approved attitudes about race, gender, sexuality, and politics. Those who resist this programming or express dissenting views are marked for special attention by counselors and administrators. Campus speakers' policies ensure that students hear only approved messages. Conservative speakers are routinely disinvited, prevented from speaking, or shouted down by mobs of students who have been taught that certain ideas are literally violence that must be resisted by any means necessary. The principle of open inquiry that once defined university life has been abandoned in favor of ideological purity. Mandatory diversity training extends this indoctrination to faculty and staff. These sessions, often conducted by outside consultants with minimal academic credentials, require participants to confess their unconscious biases and pledge allegiance to progressive causes. Resistance to such training is viewed as evidence of racism or sexism that requires additional intervention. Student government elections, dormitory programming, and even recreational activities are pressed into service for ideological purposes. Every aspect of campus life becomes a vehicle for reinforcing approved messages and punishing deviation. Students cannot escape the propaganda even in their supposedly private spaces. The most insidious aspect of this system is its self-reinforcing nature. Each graduating class has been more thoroughly indoctrinated than the last, ensuring that future faculty, administrators, and leaders will be even more committed to expanding these controls. The system produces its own justification by creating the very problems it claims to solve: racial tension, gender conflict, political polarization, which then require even more intervention. Those who attempt to resist this system face professional destruction, social ostracism, and personal attacks designed to discourage others from following their example. Chapter 7: Permanent Things in Higher Education, Recovering the University's Soul. Despite the seemingly overwhelming triumph of ideological forces in higher education, the permanent things endure. Truth cannot be abolished by administrative decree, wisdom cannot be eliminated by curriculum revision, and the human yearning for authentic education cannot be permanently suppressed. The task before us is to recover and restore the university's authentic mission while the foundations of civilization still remain accessible to those with eyes to see. The permanent things in education rest upon recognition of transcendent truth that exists independent of human will or social construction. This truth manifests itself in the mathematical relationships that govern the physical universe, the moral principles that guide human action, and the aesthetic standards that distinguish beauty from ugliness. A genuine university must be founded upon these unchanging realities rather than the shifting sands of political fashion. The classical curriculum, properly understood, provides the framework for encountering these permanent realities. The liberal arts, grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music remain as relevant today as they were in medieval universities because they reflect the fundamental structures of reality itself. Grammar teaches us the proper relationship between words and things, logic reveals the laws of rational thought, and rhetoric shows us how to communicate truth persuasively and beautifully. The great books of Western civilization contain the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors who grappled seriously with the permanent questions of human existence. Students who encounter Homer, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Dante, Shakespeare, and Burke in their original contexts discover that these authors addressed concerns that transcend their historical circumstances. Their insights remain fresh because they dealt with permanent aspects of human nature rather than temporary political causes. Philosophy, properly conceived, serves as the integrating discipline that shows how all knowledge relates to the fundamental questions of existence. Instead of being merely another specialized field, philosophy should provide the framework within which all other studies find their proper place and purpose. Students need to understand how mathematics relates to metaphysics, how history illuminates political philosophy, and how literature reveals moral truth. The recovery of genuine liberal education requires institutions willing to resist the pressures of contemporary culture and maintain standards based on permanent rather than fashionable criteria. Such institutions must be willing to be unpopular, to be denounced as elitist, and to accept smaller enrollments in exchange for educational integrity. They must choose wisdom over relevance, formation over information, and truth over utility. Faculty for such institutions must be selected primarily for their commitment to seeking and teaching truth rather than advancing political causes. They must be scholars in the classical sense, lovers of wisdom who understand their role as guardians and transmitters of civilizational heritage. They must combine intellectual competence with moral integrity, serving as examples for their students of what an educated person should be. The curriculum must be carefully structured to provide students with genuine liberal education before they specialize in particular fields. Students should encounter the great works of literature, philosophy, history, and science in chronological order, understanding how ideas develop and interact across centuries. They should learn foreign languages, study mathematics, and engage seriously with theological questions regardless of their personal beliefs. Such education requires small classes, close relationships between faculty and students, and an institutional culture that prioritizes learning over credentials. Students must be challenged intellectually, held to high standards, and expected to grow in wisdom as well as knowledge. The goal is not to produce specialists but to form whole human beings capable of thinking clearly about complex questions. The institutional culture must support serious intellectual inquiry while maintaining moral order. This means creating communities where students and faculty can pursue truth together without fear of ideological persecution while maintaining standards of conduct that reflect the dignity of human persons and the seriousness of educational enterprise. Such institutions will necessarily be small, deliberately countercultural, and dependent upon the support of those who understand that preserving authentic education serves purposes greater than immediate practical utility. They will be islands of sanity in a sea of confusion, lights shining in the gathering darkness of intellectual and moral chaos. Conclusion. The university crisis is ultimately a civilizational crisis. For institutions that abandon wisdom inevitably produce graduates incapable of preserving the culture that created them. Yet this crisis also presents an opportunity for authentic renewal, as the manifest failures of ideological education create space for recovering genuine learning. Those who love the permanent things must not despair but rather work patiently to restore the classical vision of education as formation in wisdom and virtue. Small colleges, alternative programs, and determined individuals can maintain the flame of authentic scholarship even when major institutions have surrendered to fashionable error. The task requires courage to resist popular delusions, wisdom to distinguish eternal truth from temporary opinion, and hope grounded in the knowledge that permanent things always outlast their temporary enemies. Students seeking genuine education must learn to choose carefully, seeking institutions and teachers committed to truth rather than ideology. The recovery will be gradual and partial, but it can begin wherever serious persons commit themselves to the patient work of preserving and transmitting the wisdom of ages.